Hello, welcome everybody. Thanks for coming to our session about building real-time integrations with Plaid. My name is Will Kiefer. I'm an architecture lead here at Plaid.
And I'm Nathan Tyndall. I'm also an architecture lead here at Plaid.
Awesome. We've got a really great agenda for you today to help kind of level up. Oh, don't want the music starting again. Hit the next slide again. There we go. We have got a great agenda for you today to help kind of level up your Plaid integration, right? So we've got about a half an hour to talk through things and then Q&A. And so we'll be recapping kind of some core integration concepts about how to just integrate with Plaid Link, discussing sort of how to listen for real-time events, show you a bunch of example code on how to kind of make that all happen. And we're certainly going to leave time for Q&A at the end. So don't forget there's the session tab and then the Q&A sub tab there. Please go ahead, ask your questions, upvote other people's questions so we can kind of answer what's top of mind for all of you at the end of the session. And so what we'd like you to leave with this session is basically three key takeaways. The classic why, how, why, what, and how. So why is real-time important? What kind of real-time events and data will Plaid send you? And the third is sort of how to implement and handle those events. And so hopefully you'll leave the session knowing sort of real-time support is both important and pretty easy to do, actually. So here's an example sort of personal financial management application with one account connected, right? And as the video is loading, so the user is going to go and add a second account. I don't know why it's not loading. Give it a second. Okay, well, I'll just talk over it. So basically, the user clicks add account here. They go and, oh, here we go. And then they add their account. As we see it happen, when it comes back to the application, they're going to look at the transactions and they're not going to see anything. So that Chase account that's added up top, they open up. There's no data there, right? And that's because this application doesn't have real-time integration hooked up, right? And so the user now is forced to refresh the app. They lose their state in the app. They have to kind of go refine where they were to see that that account data is there successfully. And Plaid, in fact, is sending a real-time event indicating, hey, we have our initial transactions. We have our historical transactions. They're available for you, but the app wasn't listening to them. So why bother adding real-time support? Well, as we just saw the user experience, right? Depending on your app, Plaid Link is often the top of the funnel for your users. So that sort of seamless flow is really critical to sort of garner trust by seeing the live data updates and provide that fluid onboarding for yourself. Second is reliability. As we'll see later, there's some situations where user action is required to ensure continued service. So for instance, authorization in Europe is often approved for a window of 90 days, right? And Plaid will warn you of that upcoming expiring access. And so handling those properly can sort of prevent service disruption for users. And finally, trust, right? With Plaid, users are in control of their data. So if they change access rights, if they add or remove an account, and your app handles that gracefully, then they'll trust you more, right? And it's the consumer trust that sort of is going to lead to that better conversion. So I'm going to back up ever so slightly to give sort of a quick recap on the core integration concepts, because that'll help us sort of layer the real-time additions on top and put them in context, right? So as most of you are probably aware, Plaid Link is the client-side SDK that your users will use to sort of interact with and link accounts to Plaid and then allow you access via the Plaid API, right? It handles authentication, multi-factor, OAuth, and kind of provides returning user optimizations for you. And so the first concept in the integration is link tokens. Last summer, we introduced link tokens to replace the sort of static public key that you might have previously used to initialize link, right? This is a dynamic token that's created via our link token create endpoint, and it replaces that sort of public key sort of static configuration, right? And migrating to link tokens, there's a link at the bottom if you haven't seen the migration guide of the slide, but it basically provides better error validation, better security, especially around OAuth support. It opens up event logs in our Plaid dashboard so you can get sort of better views into sessions and what's going on in your integration. And so what are the 4 steps that we need to like do a Plaid integration? There's this first one we just talked about, link token create, right? Your backend is going to call link token create and sort of pass that token that was created to your front end. Your front end is then going to initialize link using that token, right? When you initialize link, you'll provide typically callbacks to, for different events that happen during that flow. One of them is on success, which when the user successfully completes their account, you'll get a temporary public token, right? Third step is this public token in conjunction with your application secret can be exchanged for a permanent access token. And that represents the connection between your app, your user's account, and Plaid, right? That's an item. And so you get an item ID and an access token back with that. And finally, you store that access token, and then you make subsequent requests on our API for that particular item to get more data about it, right? You'll notice here that sort of token create and the token exchange require your API secret. So those both happen on the back end, right? The access token is never on the client. And so all the sort of secure stuff happens on the back end. So let's look at the code briefly to see that. But before we do that, I wanted to call out that all the examples in our slides today come from our Plaid pattern app. This is up on GitHub. It's a more advanced code sample of an integration with Plaid that covers real-time events, covers a bunch of different API use cases, and it's a deeper sample app than our typical quick start, which is just sort of the bare minimum to get up and running. So I highly recommend, after the session later on, go check this out. It's well documented and has lots of good examples for you. Okay, so we're going to go over those 4 steps again. We're just kind of looking at the code here, right? So initially, we have to create that link token, right? It's pretty straightforward here. The core thing that we're doing is creating a bunch of parameters, essentially, that sort of will configure your link session, right? So a little bit of data about the user ID. Sorry, I'm just making this a little bigger for myself. A little bit of data about the user that's doing it, what products you're using, what language, what country code, right? And your redirect UI for OAuth use cases. And that you simply pass into our link token create endpoint, right? This is using our sort of TypeScript API and an Express server in this particular example. Then you're going to use that token, and now here we are on the front end, and you're going to launch link with it. So all our APIs are pretty similar here. Sorry, let me just make the screen a little bigger. All the APIs are similar here in that they're going to sort of all take like a configuration object that has the closures with all your callbacks, and then that token. So you see there, you have an on success callback, you pass in a token, and you're just going to call our React Plaid link, use Plaid link API. Here's an example of that on success callback. In this Plaid pattern app example, we are kind of logging that success, and then we're calling our own backend with the public token we got back and some other metadata to go exchange that as that third step I showed before. If we look at iOS, we've tried to sort of keep our concepts and our APIs very similar here. So again, you have a configuration object with that token from your server, and then an on success callback. And then on iOS, you're creating a Plaid handler object, and you're basically calling open on that. Android, similarly, also a configuration object with the token, and then you launch link. Android operates a little differently because of its activity sort of mechanism. And so here, instead of providing a closure, you're sort of registering for an activity result, and that's where you get your link success and sort of do your token exchange, right? Okay, so briefly, that third step, exchanging the public token, again, fairly simple. This is the back end here. We are basically calling token exchange with the public token we received, and also includes the secret, which is the SDK that the backend is using, includes that. And then you're going to get that access token and item ID back. And finally, it's stored. Here's an example from the Plaid pattern app of using that, where you're basically calling Plaid item get with your access token, right? Item get receives more metadata about the item that might be valuable to you. Okay, that was kind of a whirlwind review. Hopefully none of that is super new to all of you, but that's just sort of the basis layer. And so now we have that integration. We've done those 4 steps. What does it take to add real time, right? First, for any item we create in the system, we need to associate a webhook URL with that item, right? And the webhook URL is the primary mechanism for real-time events, right? And so Plaid will, and you control that URL. And so when an item is configured with a webhook, Plaid will send notifications to that endpoint when events occur in the system. Events like, we updated this transaction, or, oh, hey, we need the user to come back and reauthorize access. And the array of different events is quite wide, and and Nathan will dive deeper into a few of them later in the presentation. And so after we've associated the webhook URL with the given item, then we program our own webhook endpoint to interpret those events Plaid sends and take the corresponding action. So we're going back. This is that link token create call we saw earlier where there's some parameters and then you just call link token create. How do we add real time? Well, there's just one new line, right? We provide our webhook. So in this instance, myapp.plaid.com is the sample app. It would be your url.com/your webhook endpoint, right? So that's it. Now when we've created this item, we have that webhook hooked up and we're going to start receiving events. And so I'm going to toss it over to Nathan to show you sort of how to handle those webhooks, what kind of data you're going to get, and we'll dive a little deeper on that.
Thanks, Will. So like we're going to dive a little deeper into the implementation now. So the first thing I want to talk about is the actual structure of the payload that Plaid will send to you. And the body always has two fields, the webhook type and the webhook code. And the type is sort of the top level organizational unit, and that generally indicates the general product or object that's referenced in that webhook. So there's the type, and then there's the code beneath that type. And there are also sometimes additional fields that are sent in that webhook, depending upon the type and code combination. And that's what type specific fields refers to here on the left. So for example, there's the auth webhook type, which will indicate that the webhook is something about the auth product. And then there's the item webhook type, which indicates that the webhook has something to do with an item. And beneath each type, there's an array of codes that zoom in further. And on the right here rather, you can see an example. So there's like this is the initial update transactions webhook. The type is transactions, the code is initial update. And then there's some type specific fields that give more information about this particular webhook being sent. So the item ID and error and information about new transactions that were sent in this webhook. So that's kind of the framework that we'll be thinking about today as we go through the implementation. So I want to walk through the actual server implementation now. So what I've done here is create a pretty simple HTTP request handler. And the first thing that this does is inspect the webhook type field of the request body, and then delegates work to a different handler depending upon the type. So that's what's happening here. We pull out that webhook type from the request body, and then we have sort of a map of different handlers depending upon the type. So we have a transactions handler, an item handler, and then based upon the type, we sort of call out into the right handler. And then we wait for that to be done. And when the request is done, we respond with the 200 status code. This is somewhat important. If there's a non-200 response, or if there's no response at all, within 10 seconds from the webhook endpoint, then Plaid will retry sending the webhook up to 2 times within a few minutes in between each webhook. So for good housekeeping purposes, we just return 200 after we've completed work to reconcile this with our systems. So that's the basic handler. So I wanted to zoom back out a bit now and talk a little bit more about the different classes of events at a more conceptual level and how this can provide value to your application. So generally, there's 2 types of events. There's the item events and there are the product events. And generally, if you cover these 2 classes of events, then every dimension of your Plaid integration will be pretty seamless. We really only add webhooks if we think they're useful. So if you should integrate with them because there's generally a reason why we added them. Webhooks are generally used to communicate changes to an item, such as when you make configuration changes to the item, we'll send a notification that we acknowledge that, or errors are encountered with an item. And the errors and many of these webhooks often require user action to resolve to maintain continuity of service. And this can be critical. And because if the item is in an error state, then the user's service with your app is potentially interrupted. So by integrating with this sort of real-time notification functionality, you have the opportunity to minimize the amount of time where service is interrupted. So that kind of covers the purpose of the item webhooks. And the product webhooks, on the other hand, are generally used to service you notifications for when the product has had a meaningful update. So this can be data refreshes for the transactions product and other products that have regular updates, or notifications that the product is ready for cases where Plaid's product works in an asynchronous fashion. I think both Signal and Assets are a good example of that. So that's kind of the high level 2 classes of events that we'll dive deeper on today. So I want to walk through 4 of the different types of webhook codes for the item webhook, just because I think after walking through them, it helps us understand why these are important for having a solid Plaid integration. So the new accounts available webhook code is our newest item associative webhook, and this was released in late September as part of account selection v2. I believe Adam demoed this on the main stage yesterday. And as part of the account selection v2 initiative, the end user will have the option to select which accounts they want to share with each app. So if I have 3 accounts with my bank, I could easily choose to only share 2 of them with any given application. And this is really great from the perspective of giving end users transparency and control over how their data is shared. However, this can result in a situation where new accounts that the user creates to their bank don't show up in our apps. So for example, if I opened a new credit card, you wouldn't automatically get access to that. You have to get the user to reauthorize, to expand their authorization to include those new accounts. So to solve for this, this webhook is fired when Plaid detects a new account for items with account selection v2. So if we see a new account show up, we'll send you a notification, and we know that that account is not authorized for you. We'll send you a notification saying like, hey, maybe you need to get the user to come back to expand their authorization. And you would do this by prompting the user to come back through link update mode. And just to be extra clear, this one is only pertinent for account selection v2, which you have to opt into. But this is relatively new functionality, and I suggest looking into this if you're looking into upgrading your Plaid integration. So that's the first one that covers everything I want to say about the new accounts available. Okay, the next one is the pending expiration webhook. Will alluded to this earlier. And some of our connections, particularly those in Europe, have a fixed expiry date after which Plaid's connection will no longer work. So under regulation of PSD2, we only have access to the end user's account for 90 days. And then after that, the end user has to come back and reauthorize. And this can result in a situation where the user is having to come back every 90 days. And then if they service is interrupted on the 90th day, and then they come back on the 99th day, then you have 9 days of disruption. So to help solve for this, we do send you a prophylactic notification so that you can prompt the user to reauthorize consent in order to avoid this disruption. So 7 days before, or I guess on the 83rd day, we send you this notification. Then you have a week to get the user to come back and sort of preemptively reauthorize consent to avoid that disruption. So this one, I believe this one, yeah, most pertinent to Europe, but generally, like if we ever think that the consent is going to expire, we will send this to you. Okay, the next one is the user permission revoked. So as some of you may be aware, our privacy portal on my.plaid.com allows users to view and manage their connections. So we allow for both visibility into where your accounts are connected, as well as the ability to remove access. So since users have this control, this can result in situations where the developer's access to data is removed by the end user. So if this happens, the end user is expecting for like any data that they have, any connectivity that they have on sort of with the app to be removed. So to help you like address this, this webhook will be fired. So if the user revokes access, we fire this webhook, and you can take the appropriate action that you think is the correct thing. So generally, this means deleting the data. Maybe you want to move the account from like your connection management page, unless you need that access in order to continue providing your services. So that kind of covers the purpose of this one. And I think on the next slide, there's an example of kind of what this looks like in practice on the pattern app sort of connection management page. Finally is the error webhook code. And this webhook code, there's lots of different errors that can happen. And this one's fired whenever the item enters an error state. And generally, yeah, like the remediation here is similarly to get the end user to reauthorize their connection by launching link again in update mode. So both all of the new accounts available pending expiration and the error webhook codes, all like the path for remediation is generally the same, but you need to get the user to come back and reauthorize their access. Okay, so the example I was thinking about with the pattern app, I think, is a little later on, so we'll get to that in a sec. So I wanted to look at the implementation now, just how does the item webhook handler work? So you'll recall our little webhook handler map where we've registered different handlers for the different webhook types, and we'll zoom in now to the handle item webhook. And generally the way this works is just kind of a switch statement here. And then it's inspecting the webhook code, and then for each of the different webhook codes, it decides what to do. And the one I wanted to zoom in farther was the item error handler, because that one is generally one of the more complicated ones. And just to talk through like what the pattern app does to sort of reconcile state. And yeah, so the error webhook code is interesting because there's actually a sub hierarchy within the error code of like sub errors, because errors, there's lots of different errors. So, and we try to give you as much information as we can for the errors. So we have a switch statement which inspects the error code and then takes a corresponding action. So one error code is the item login required code, and to save space on the slide, I only included this one, and this one, when this webhook error code is sent, it essentially means we need to get the user to reauthorize. So what the pattern app does here actually is it's maintaining internal state about the health that it thinks that an item is in. So here it says first get the item by the Plaid item ID that was sent to us in the webhook, and then update the item status to bad. And bad is sort of an enum. That's how the pattern app is tracking item state internally. So now the pattern app has done the work to sort of reconcile its own state about items with state of Plaid system. And we can implement something on our side to send a notification to the end user now that we know that the item needs repair. So one reasonable implementation would be to have a nightly or weekly cron for giving end user to remind them to reconnect their application. But you could do fancier things like send them an immediate push notification, depending upon what strategy you think would make the most sense for your application. You know a lot more about that than we do, but we give you as much information as we can so that as soon as we can, so that you can get the user to come back as quickly as possible. Okay, and yeah, just zooming in, like the item login required. There'd be other case statements for the different error codes, and all that there's documentation on plaid.com about what's the right thing to do for each error code. Okay, and here's what I was thinking about earlier. So the consent management pane I was thinking about. So you can see that the pattern app shows that, okay, you've connected two banks to the pattern app, and there's Chime, there's Wells Fargo. And after we received a webhook for, say, the Chime app, then that we sort of updated that enum to bad, and that's causing this like Chime row here to show login required here. So, and everything is synchronized there. And then if you play around the pattern app at some point, you can click into this and then it will launch Lincoln update mode. And that's generally a good pattern, appropriately named. That's generally a good pattern for like the right way to kind of manage the reauthorization as well. Okay, so now we'll go a little deeper on some of the product webhooks, and like the one I want to go deeper on is the transactions webhook. And transactions are a really great example of how the webhook functionality helps make sure that the data is really as synchronized as possible between Plaid, the bank, and your application. Plaid will generally refresh transactions data for each item, and the majority of our webhooks occur regularly in this regard, about once every 6 hours, though it does vary by institution. So like with the transactions product, like you really want to be leveraging the webhooks, because that's like you will get notified whenever we update the data. Otherwise, you're doing something creative like polling, and then you won't always get new data every time you poll. So you want to, in order to and to not spam our APIs, yeah, it's good that for using the webhooks. Okay, so the transactions webhooks are also critical for one of our features of Plaid Exchange called real-time transactions. And this one's really cool. And with real-time transactions, Plaid has a really tight technical integration with financial institutions that allow you to receive notifications as soon as a transaction occurs at a bank. And this essentially works by the bank sending a notification to Plaid, which subsequently sends a notification to you. And you can even forward this to your end user through push notification. So if you're integrated with our webhooks already, there's actually nothing you need to do to benefit from this. You will get this functionality as soon as we roll this out with more FIs, but it's pretty cool to see that the webhooks functionality is enabling this sort of like really real-time type integration with some institutions. So I wanted to take a deeper look now at the code for how to make the transactions webhook work. Okay, so now we're like zoomed in on that, like sort of, we have our webhook sort of map, and now we're zoomed in on like the transactions webhook handler that we had registered there. So for the transactions webhooks, Plaid doesn't actually send the transactions in the payload. Instead, we sort of send a notification that the transactions are ready, and then you make a call back to the Plaid API to fetch the data. So the pattern app stores transaction data in its own database, so that it's not always fetching data from the Plaid API every time that you need to render something to the end user. So now we kind of have this interesting problem of we have state stored on the pattern app side, and there's some new information from Plaid, and we have a job to do of reconcile those two worlds. And that's a lot of what the complexity of the transactions webhook handler is really about. So there's different webhook codes beneath each beneath the transactions webhook type, similar to the item webhook. There's initial update, historical update, and default update. The only difference between these is the date range of transactions that become available. The work needed to respond to this webhook is the same in all the cases, and transactions removed is sort of an optimization that allows you to deal with removed transactions in a slightly more efficient way. So we're going to dive into the initial update code here. And this is what that case statement would look like. So for the initial update, that's fired when there's 30 days of transactions available. This is the first webhook that's sent after you connect a transactions item. And for all the different webhooks we receive, we need to handle this update. And the difference is just how far back we need to pull. So for initial update, we need to look for the past 30 days of transactions. So in the code now, we sort of, what's the current timestamp? Start date is 30 days ago, and then we call this helper function, handle transactions update, which will handle the update between start date now, and then all the other case statements would be the same. It would just be like either past 14 days or past 2 years for the other webhooks. Okay, so we're going to look at the handle transactions update functionality now. Now, as a reminder, the goal here is just to make sure that the transactions that we're storing in our application server match what we are servicing to the end user. And generally, the way to do this is we're going to use a Plaid transaction ID as a source of truth for this. So this is kind of a lot of code, so I'm going to walk through it step by step. Okay, so the first step is just to fetch new transactions from the Plaid API. So that's what the webhook told us to do. We got a webhook, it said there's 30 days of transactions available. We pull those transactions. We store those. We have now a map of something called incoming transactions, which is a map from Plaid transaction ID to transaction. Okay, the next step is to fetch the existing transactions that we've already stored. So that's what the pattern app has stored on its server side. We fetch the same transactions within the same date range. So now we have a sort of map of the new transactions or the incoming transactions. That's what the variable is called here, and a map of the existing transactions. Okay, now we have kind of a fun job of like making these worlds map. So making these worlds match. So anything that's not stored should be inserted. So we look at anything that's already existing, and if we find an incoming transaction that's not present, we know that we need to insert that into the database. That's what this sort of logic is doing here. And the second thing is that anything that is currently stored that was not returned by the Plaid API needs to be removed. There's a few reasons why transactions can become removed. The main reason is that the pending transaction IDs will change when a transaction goes to posted. So if I go to like a restaurant and then I like add a tip, and then the transaction will show up as pending for some period of time, and then we'll post and maybe the amount will change, and the transaction ID will change there, and we have sort of a back reference to the original ID. So pending to post is one reason why a transaction might become removed. It's also possible that the transactions are removed by the bank because the bank has reversed or stopped the payment or stopped the transaction for some reason. And the transaction could become removed if the details are changed by the bank for whatever reason so extensively that we can't recognize new and old versions of the transactions to store. New and old versions of the transactions are the same. Ultimately, we're going to do our best to return the best view we have of our end user transactions. So it's really important that we stay synchronized with that for usage and decisioning purposes. So at the end of this logic, yeah, we just add new accounts, we insert transactions, then we delete anything that's not supposed to be there anymore. So we did hear your feedback that this process is overly tricky and cumbersome. And yeah, like you're having to do this custom reconciliation logic. There's questions like, what do you do if transactions mutated, pending to posted? You might want to handle that workflow in a slightly different way. And you have to do all this work to overfetch new transactions from the Plaid API, and then reconcile things by doing a read before write on your side. And to be honest, all of this is a little annoying. So we did hear your feedback, and we are releasing a new interface soon that should make this a lot easier. And basically, our new endpoint will return a paginated record for transactions over a given period of time. And this will enable you to query Plaid to see what transactions were added, removed, or modified during a certain time period. And this should really simplify many of your transaction webhook handling code because you can just sort of see a diff of what changed rather than having to compute the diff. And we can just align upon what the diff is, and then we'll present that to you, and it should make your life a lot easier. So I believe Royce previewed this sync API in the main stage events, and we're really actively looking for beta customers for Q4. So if you're interested in testing this out, definitely reach out to your account manager about this. You just have like an example sort of request and response here. So the request, you just give a Plaid access token and a cursor. It's paginated because there could potentially be a lot of change records that we need to service to you. And then the response sort of just has like added transaction ID, details about what was added. If anything was modified, we'll give you those details, removed similarly, and then a pagination cursor. And there's just a diagram on the right showing sort of like more like from a like logical level what's happening. So on day 2, when transaction 3 is added, then we will get transaction 3 showing up when we call that endpoint. So that recaps it for me. So I really hope this helps walk us through in a little bit more detail, like kind of how the item webhooks can serve purpose to you, and similarly, like for the transactions webhook, both motivate like why this can be important, the value this can give to you, dive a little bit more deep into some of the details, and really at the end, like demonstrate the value to you. So I'm going to hand it back to Will for final recap.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah. So hopefully, as Nathan said, like this gave you a sense of like why real time is important, right? Like that experience of your users, the reliability of those connections, and sort of the trust garnered by sort of making that stuff seamless for everybody. And hopefully you have a good sense of sort of what classes of events you'll receive. And thanks for the deep dive into transactions. And again, how to implement it. I do recommend, please do go check out that Plaid pattern app. It's a good hands-on way to kind of dive in and see what's going on. As Royce mentioned in chat, please, there's if you're kind of specifically want to dig more into transactions or general developer issues, there's that office hours later today. Okay, awesome. So thank you for listening. Thank you for the questions. It's really great. I really glad folks ask questions. Nathan and I are on you could get to us other ways if you think of something later on Twitter or on something, LinkedIn or whatever, your account manager. I do want to pitch the next session coming up is learning how to integrate the Plaid mobile SDKs for Android, iOS, and React Native into your app. And there's going to be some live coding for that to see that. We've done a lot of work on all those SDKs this year. So if you have a mobile app and you're interested in that, please do check that out. That's the next session with Zach and Alexis in about 15 minutes from now. So again, thank you all. Really great to virtually talk to you, and enjoy the rest of your Plaid forum.